This is the Redeeming God podcast, where we rescue scripture and theology from the shackles of religion. Well, hello there. It's Jeremy Myers, and I'm your teacher for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. You ever struggle with anger? Maybe sometimes you do, and you feel guilty about it. Today, I'm going to give you the freedom to be angry. You do not need to feel guilty about anger. We're going to talk about that today and what you should do with anger when it comes along, rather than feel guilty about it. We're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27 to learn that truth there. Before we get into that, I just want to give you a little update on my writing and some teaching and other things going on behind the scenes. I'm currently working on a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. I've got 2 chapters done, so 26 more to go. But I will be teaching Matthew on this podcast when I'm done with Ephesians. So my goal here is to sort of quickly get through Ephesians and then move on to Matthew, so you can keep up to date with my progress through Matthew. That's where we're headed next after Ephesians. And once I'm done with Ephesians so that I can focus more time on Matthew, I will also return to finishing up my discipleship course on the Gospel Dictionary. I sort of stopped out at the word love, but I do want to finish that course. So if you're part of my discipleship group, thank you so much for bearing with me during the pause, and I will get back to that and start putting up new lessons there as soon as Ephesians is over, and then move on to some other courses as well. If you're not part of my discipleship group, there's lots of courses there for you to take. You can learn more about it and join by going to redeeminggod.com/join. All right, with that in mind, let's get into our study of Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 and 27. I should say as well that the last couple of podcast episodes have been rather too long, and so I want to try to pare the length down a little bit. And part of that is going to be me just not saying everything that I want to say about a particular text. But if you want the additional information, I'm going to be including it online. And so you can go to redeeminggod.com/Ephesians 4, 26, 27. I'm not going to try and give you all the punctuation for that, but probably if you just go to Google and search Redeeming God, Ephesians 4, 26 to 27, Google will give you the proper page. That way you can see some of the stuff, the information, illustrations, even some application points that I had prepared for this podcast, but cut out at the last minute just to try to make it shorter in my podcast length. If you want it all and you want long podcasts, please let me know. But if you prefer the shorter ones, let me know that way too, just so I get a little feedback. You can just leave a comment on the Ephesians 4, 26 and 27 page about your preference, or you can just go to my website at redeeminggod.com, go to the bottom, there's a contact me form, a link down there, and you can let me know that way. That will send me an email. So let's talk about anger in Ephesians 4, 26 and 27. I don't know if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's classic book called The Screwtape Letters. Great book. In it, there is a demon by the name of Screwtape, and he is writing letters to his nephew named Wormwood. And Wormwood he's sort of a new demon, and he's trying to tempt his human subject, his human assignment, to make sure that he does not become a Christian. And so Screwtape is writing letters to Wormwood to give him suggestions on how best to do that. In one letter, Screwtape advises Wormwood that if he wants to keep his assigned human on the road to hell, the best method is not through tempting him with the big sins, like murder and adultery and things like that, but the best method is to tempt him with the small, little sins, or maybe even things that aren't sinful at all in themselves, but which just don't have anything of eternal significance and keep the mind and heart occupied so that they don't think about things about God or spiritual things. Okay? And so Screwtape writes, it does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Now, I'm not saying that cards are sinful. Okay. Also, if you know anything about me in my writing, my teaching, I'm also not saying that hell is a place of eternal conscious torment. That's a little surprise to you. You can check out my book, What is Hell, available on Amazon, where I tell you what the Bible teaches about hell. Pretty surprising and shocking, and most people miss it. So I guess I probably disagree with what Lewis is saying here a little bit through Screwtape, but the overall point is the same. All right? Christianity and the temptations that come, we tend to focus in church and religion and in our Bible study groups and online about all the big sins. We're always pointing at the big sins that other people are committing. Murder and adultery and some of these other things that take up all of our attention nowadays. And meanwhile, we're completely ignoring, missing, maybe even coddling, accepting, welcoming some of the more seemingly innocent sins, the insignificant sins, the sins that seem to be, it's no big deal. All right? In our series through the book of Ephesians right now, we're in this section in Ephesians chapter 4 where Paul discusses 5 deadly sins in the life of the believer. And guess what? All 5 sins are, they're somewhat small. They're somewhat insignificant. At least that's how they seem to us compared to some of the other things that might be out there. None of them really are what we might term big sins. They all seem to be small, insignificant, unimportant, relatively insignificant type of sins. But that is exactly where we are deceived, as Screwtape pointed out to his nephew Wormwood. Now, last time we looked at the sin of lying, and we saw that Satan, who is the father of lies, has deceived us into thinking that the little lies don't matter. Yeah, a little bending of the truth, it's okay. A little twisting of the facts. But these little insignificant half-truths lead us deeper into greater and bigger lies and ultimately away from God, who is the Father and source of all truth. So yes, even little lies are serious and deadly sins if we really understand what's going on. And today, as we look at Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 to 27, we're looking at another of these deadly sins. And we're going to see that this one also appears to be relatively insignificant. So this sin in Ephesians 4, 26 and 27 is the sin of anger. And the text says this, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil." Now, just by way of sort of background, if you can go to my website and go look at my sermons from the past under the sermon section, and you can go find how I used to preach this text, Matthew 4, 26 and 27. And if you do that, you will see that in the past, I used to try to make a distinction between righteous anger and sinful anger, right? And so we read in the Bible at various places that God is angry. We know that God does not sin. And here it seems to be that Paul is saying that anger is sinful. And so theologians and Bible scholars, we have tried to make a distinction between God's righteous anger and human sinful anger. I don't believe that any longer. I don't think that's a helpful distinction. I think it's outright wrong. I think it confuses the point rather than clarifies it. It is true that Paul wants us to be careful with anger, but Paul is not saying that anger is sinful. But let me go further. Paul is saying it is okay to be angry. Look right there at the first part of verse 26. He says, Be angry. Now, I'm reading from the New King James Version, but some of your Bible translations might say something different. But the Greek is pretty clear. Paul's saying, yeah, it's okay to be angry. In fact, be angry. He's not only giving you permission, it's almost even not quite a command, but there are times in life where you must be angry, when anger is a good response, a helpful response. So if anger was sinful, then Paul would be telling us to commit a sin here. And of course, Paul's not going to do that. So the only way to recognize what Paul is saying here is to recognize that anger is not a sin. And we're not going to try to differentiate between righteous anger and sinful anger. Paul doesn't do that. That's not his point. It shouldn't be our point either. So Paul is saying it's okay to be angry. All right. And what Paul goes on to do is tell us what to do with our anger, and also some of the pitfalls that can come from anger. Okay? Anger is a little bit like a knife. A knife is a helpful tool, but if you're not careful with a knife, you can stab yourself in the leg, and you can hurt yourself pretty seriously. You could even kill yourself if you're not careful. Anger is like that. And so that is how to understand Paul's statement here. He's saying, be angry, have a knife. You have a knife is a helpful tool, but be careful with your knife. Be careful with your anger. So let's try to understand this a little bit more. Paul is saying, be angry, and therefore it is helpful to be angry at times. Like when? Well, when we see injustice in the world. When we see the innocent being condemned, when we see war and violence and bloodshed. God is always against such things. And when we see these things, when we see politicians or whatever trying to be warmongers and stir up problems around the world, that should lead us to anger. When we see theft and violence and all sorts of injustice, that should lead us to anger. But even on a more personal level, when someone treats you poorly, anger is a natural response to that. And it's okay. When someone physically assaults you, your initial response is anger. And that's okay. Anger is a healthy emotional response to many of the situations that you are faced with in life. And it's very wrong of us Christians to say, oh, don't ever be angry. No. When bad things happen to you in life, when bad things happen to other people in life, Paul says, and I say with Paul, be angry. And this also helps fit with God's anger. This is why God is angry at certain things in the world. Why Jesus got angry when he saw the temple being abused and what the religious leaders were doing there, taking advantage of the poor in Jerusalem who were coming for the holiday. Okay, so it's okay to be angry. Anger is natural. God gets angry. Jesus got angry. We get angry. It's okay. You have permission. In fact, you are invited to be angry. Now, you're saying, Jeremy, yeah, but look at the rest of the verse. I know. This is the warning. Just like with a knife, it's sharp. Anger is sharp. Be careful. And that's what Paul is going on to say about anger. All right, look at the next part of verse 26. Paul writes, be angry and do not sin. In other words, be careful with your anger. Paul is emphasizing that point here by quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting from Psalm 4:4. And Psalm 3 and 4 were written by David at a time when he had every right to be angry. His kingdom had been unjustly taken away from him through the treasonous actions of his son, Absalom. Absalom had died and tricked his way into gaining a following and then had led a rebellion against his father David. So David had to flee for his life. And Absalom then set up a tent on the roof of the palace and committed fornication with all of David's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. If you want to read about that, 2 Samuel 15 and 16. So Absalom was a wicked man doing wicked things, and this moved David's heart to anger. And so he writes in Psalm 4:4, be angry and do not sin. And if you go read what David did not sin. He was angry, but he kept himself from sinning. He acted and behaved kindly and justly. He even tried to spare the life of his treasonous and fornicating son. All of his actions were loving towards his son. Sure, he was angry, but he acted in love, and so he avoided sin. Now, you know the rest of the story. As the events turned out, in the heat of battle, Absalom's hair got caught in a tree, and he was killed by Joab, one of David's commanders. David was pretty upset about this also. He didn't want his son to die. He only had love and forgiveness for his son. Okay? But this is a positive example from David where he was angry but kept his anger from turning into sin. Scripture's course is full of negative examples where people do allow their anger to become sinful. Remember how Jacob stole Esau's birthright through lying and deception? Well, Esau, rightfully so, became angry about that. Jacob deceived his brother Esau. Jacob took advantage of Esau's hunger. And so Esau became angry about that. And you know what? That's fine. He had every right to be angry. He had been tricked. But later, he let his anger lead him into sin when he promised to kill Jacob. So there's a negative example. Jonah the prophet is another example. He was righteously indignant about the terrible sins of the people of Nineveh. They were horrible, horrible people in Nineveh. And if all of us lived back at that time, all of us would be on the side of Jonah, nodding our heads in agreement, saying, God, just destroy them all. Okay? But his anger got the upper hand when Jonah failed to preach to Nineveh the whole message that God had given him to preach. And Jonah, out of spite and resentment, sat down to watch the fireworks show. Hopefully Nineveh would get destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what he wanted. And when that didn't happen, Jonah got mad at God at all. If you're sort of curious about more on Jonah, I did do an entire teaching podcast series on Jonah. You can go and check that out back in the archives. So the point is, anger is one of those things that easily burns out of control. And when that happens, that's when we fall into sin. It is a sin giving vent to our anger, that which we need to avoid. When anger leads to sin, when that happens, it can have devastating consequences in your life. You can destroy your relationships with other people. You can destroy your own health. You can destroy your finances. You can get terminated from your job. You could end up in prison. All sorts of bad things can happen when we do not keep a tight rein on our good anger. And so that's why Paul is telling us here, be angry, but be careful with it because it can lead you into sin. All right. So Paul in the rest of verse 26 and then on into verse 27 gives us sort of two suggestions. Well, one suggestion and one sort of reminder about why this is important to do on what to do with our anger. So in the end of verse 26, Paul gives us this advice on how to keep from sinning. All right, he says, you are angry, fine, good, natural, normal. God's angry. Jesus was angry. It's good to be angry. But in your anger, don't sin. And we might say, that's good of you to say, Paul, but how? And now he tells us how at the end of verse 26. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Okay, what does this mean? When I was first married, I should say, my wife and I, Wendy and I, we tried to practice this. So whenever we got in an argument in our, day-to-day, just happens in life, we decided that we would not go to sleep until we had resolved our difficulties. And there were times where we stayed awake all night long. And you know what? That didn't actually help us because the next day then we were short on sleep. So then we're irritable with our kids. We're more irritable with each other. And it just has a snowball effect because now we're creating more instances where we have the temptation to react wrongly to other people. And if we're irritable towards them, then they get angry towards us. And it's a bad thing. So Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath, but it's not, I don't think we should take this literally. Besides that, we weren't being literal anyway. The sun certainly went down on our anger and we stayed up all night long, losing sleep. That's not what Paul had in mind. He's not saying, you have to resolve your anger issues by 9:30 p.m. or whenever the sun goes down, in the winter, 5 or 6, or boy, if you live in the Antarctic at winter time, you just can't ever get angry because it's always night there. It's ridiculous. Okay. It's not about what time the sun goes down or anything like that. Paul's basically just saying, get rid of your anger quickly. That's all he's saying. It's a general principle. Look, you're going to feel anger when bad things happen, and that's okay. Now, to keep from sinning in your anger, get rid of it. Don't dwell on it. Don't harbor it. Don't hold on to it. Well, how quickly is quickly? I don't know. It depends on the situation. But there might be times where you can get rid of it in 10 seconds or 15 seconds. There might be other times where it takes a day or two, or maybe even a week or month. I don't know, depending on the severity of the situation. But just recognize the longer you let it go on, the more likely that it will lead to sin. And that is what Paul talks about in verse 27. He says, nor give place to the devil. The longer you hold on to anger, the longer you harbor it, the longer you let it grow and fester and sort of take over your life, the more likely it is that your anger starts to lead to sinful attitudes and behaviors, sinful ways of treating other people. Okay, so Paul says, be angry, but don't sin. You want to avoid sinning, get rid of it, because if you don't get rid of it, you might be giving the devil a foothold into your life, which will lead to sin. All right, foothold is sort of like a beachhead. When an army is trying to take over a foreign country, maybe they land on their beach and they try to establish a position there, and then they start moving inland. Well, that's what happens when we hold on to anger. It gives the devil a foothold, a beachhead in our life, from which the devil is then able to launch more attacks. So this is what Paul is saying. Be angry, don't sin. How do we keep from sinning? Get rid of your anger quickly. Whatever that means, depending on the situation, because if you don't, then it can very easily lead to sin. Mark Twain, always humorous on this. He said, when angry, count to 4. If very angry, swear. That's probably not good advice. Better advice might be from Thomas Jefferson. He said, when angry, count to 10. If very angry, count to 100. Yeah, maybe we could say, if very, very, very angry, count to 1,000 or something. I don't know. Okay. The point is, and in both cases, they both recognize the truth, that when you're angry, you don't beat yourself up about the anger. Anger is natural. Anger is normal. Sometimes anger not sometimes. Anger just always is. It's an emotion. Emotions aren't bad or good. They just are. And that's the same with anger. But we need to be careful with anger that it doesn't become this knife that we stick into our leg or we slash our own throat with. Okay? And so this is the message of Paul here in Ephesians 4:26 and 27. Anger is a serious sin. It's not something to be not a serious sin. Anger can lead to a serious sin. It's not something to be overlooked, neglected, ignored. Okay? Some people are angry all the time, and that is not a way to live, not a healthy way to live for themselves or anybody else. They need to get rid of that anger. Forgive themselves, forgive other people, love one another, love themselves, and all of the other wonderful teachings that Scripture contains about anger and wrath. Okay? So rather than let anger spur you on towards sin, let anger spur you on towards love and righteousness and forgiveness. Anger it does cause us to move towards action. When we see injustice, when we see bad things happen, okay, our instinct is to retaliate, to lash out. Rather, we should use that energy, that flush of energy that goes through our body to spur us on towards a helpful, righteous, godly action instead. And so the next time you're angry, look, don't get upset at yourself. Don't beat yourself up. Instead, recognize it. Say, yeah, I'm angry, and I have every right to be angry. And this anger is good. Thank you, God, for this anger. In fact, God, you're angry too about this. And then work to get rid of that anger as quickly as possible. Let it spur you on towards something righteous and loving. Don't let the anger get a foothold in your life so that it leads you down a sinful path that will have devastating consequences for you and for your family. Now, there's so much more I could say about this, but I'm not. And if you want to learn more about this, see some of the things I did not include in this podcast episode, please feel free to visit the link for this podcast on my website. It's going to be redeeminggod.com/Ephesians 4:26-27. And you can search Google and it'll find that for you that way also. Okay? Hey, thank you so much for listening. We'll be picking back up next time with Ephesians 4:28 and another of these seemingly insignificant sins that Paul wants us to get rid of and take care of in our lives. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Talk to you later. Bye.